The last session here today, day 0, overcoming challenges in relating to the UN and global catastrophic risks. So we're bringing together the two big themes, the UN and catastrophic risks. And please welcome Carolina García Arbeláez. She's the Regional Sustainability Manager for ABInBev. She's also an op-ed writer for the leading sustainability magazine in Colombia, and she's a member of the think tank Transforma. And I'll give the stage to you. Thank you.
Challenge to be the last panel. I know that all of you must be tired, hungry, and a little bit jet lagged. I am a little bit jet lagged, I must confess. But the good news is that we have an amazing group of panelists here. So I'm really confident that we're going to have a lot of fun and that the discussion will be great. So just to introduce our panelists, we have Cristina Manzano. She's editor-in-chief of Esglobal. We have Anthony, or Tony Banbury, and he's a Yale professor, but he also knows a lot about the UN because he was a former assistant to the Secretary General on field support. And we have also Hajer Sharief, who is the co-founder of Together We Build It, and she's also part of Kofi Annan's movement, Extremely Together. So we have civil society, former UN and academia and media sitting in the same table. So, and we've been discussing throughout the day about catastrophic risks and the challenges the UN faces, but we haven't discussed that much about how this relates to citizens and the challenges of citizens caring about this. So, Cristina, you as a media expert, we are overwhelmed with media news talking about catastrophic risks, and yet the citizens care so little about catastrophic risk. Why do they relate so little to this, and how can we overcome these challenges?
Partly because we cannot identify just global risk. There are many, many issues going on there, and people are really overwhelmed. In some aspects, like climate change, I would say that the conversation started wrong, because I say that it was kidnapped by experts at the very beginning, by scientists, and their language, the way they addressed the issues was very, very far from people's interests and concerns. We couldn't understand. I mean, when you talk all the time about tons of CO2, of capturing carbon and things like that, you don't know what they are talking about. So when the conversation started to change, somehow it was a bit too late to make it a general concern, a global risk concern. That has changed. As you said, we are now overwhelmed, and sometimes we are too overwhelmed. I mean, we've passed from not understanding to having too much information, which is a problem of our era too. We have too much information and we don't know how to choose. And there's something else that was mentioned this morning. We are talking mostly about patterns, and media cover events. I always think, and I always say that most media are neglecting their pedagogical role. We have the obligation to transmit information and knowledge, but we are under pressure. So events get covered very quickly, more and more quickly now with social media, now more and more quickly now when we have the need to make people click, where everything is valued by volume of visits, volume of people watching and so on, and we neglect again analysis and we neglect reflection. But that also has to do with the transformation of the media, with the nature of media and the changing nature of media nowadays. As I said, they are under pressure more and more with all the internet revolution. They are trying to adapt, but in the way, and together with the financial crisis, in the way many outlets just disappeared, and that is also a challenge. But on the other hand, media, by definition, are mostly local. And so global risk have always, and media have a national dimension. And when you are tackling global issues, it's very difficult to really give them that global dimension, because you always tell, you always try to take the things to your own understanding, which is right, but at the same time you are leaving part of the picture out. There are some attempts to overcome this. There are some outlets you all know about CNN, for instance, about Al Jazeera, about RT, which try to have a more regional impact, a more regional audience. But in my view, that is also somehow biased, because most times we are talking about an audience in English. And that is, that has naturally a Western view of the world. So again, we are talking about global things with a very Westernized perspective. And for instance, I must admit, I don't know Chinese. I can't understand a word of Chinese. And we are leaving 1.3 billion people out of my understanding. I don't know what they think. I don't know what they do, unless through, again, Western media. So that's all part of the reasons why I think people care. People don't care as much as we think they should, but they are starting to react.
Yeah, and just before moving into Tony, can you give us an example of how can we communicate more effectively about climate change? Because I think that is always complex for people who work in climate change to do that. Maybe you can give a suggestion.
As I said, we're starting to react. I loved the protesting thing. I really think that protest is a way of being part of this world, and that we have to improve it. And in fact, we have now media, we have the resources to do it. And I love this example, maybe you know, about the Save the Bees initiative, which Avast, the digital platform, claims to have launched. For 7 years, they have been asking people to sign and to enforce a ban on the pesticides that are killing the bees. And as you all know, the bees are an essential part of nature, and for pollination, for many things. And a few weeks ago, the European Union has banned these pesticides. This doesn't go to the global level, but I mean, we are still 28 countries enforcing one very important thing. Another example, which are not only citizens, it's more digital, journalism platforms. I love the example of the Panama Papers. Maybe you know, this is a consortium of media outlets all throughout the world to tackle a global risk as corruption. And we are always, we see catastrophes, but corruption is a major global risk, as the foundation knows very well. And they establish a very innovative system to go through data, to analyze data, to make that relevant for their audiences. And at the end, they came up with first the Panama Papers, then the Paradise Papers, so they're working on that.
Great, so 2 cases that give us optimism. So, but if there's a challenge for people to relate with catastrophic risk, there's even more challenges for people to relate with a system as complex as the UN. Tony, in 2006, you wrote, "I love the UN, but it is failing." And it was also when you retired from the UN, and in part because this system, you believe, citizens don't feel represented or invested in. So how can this change, and what is your main opinion on that?
Yeah, you mentioned an article I got in a lot of trouble for, but that was 2016, not 2006, just 2 years ago when I left the UN, and I worked for more than 20 years in the United Nations, worked all across the globe in humanitarian response, natural crisis response, peacekeeping, headquarters, started from a very junior level and made it to rather senior level. And as I said in the article, though, it was the New York Times that chose the headline, I do love the UN, and I believe it's an extremely important organization that is essential to the future of the world. But it has some serious faults, and it's a very particular culture that's almost impossible to understand if you haven't been in it and part of it. And it's not only hard for regular citizens from wherever in the world to understand, even for diplomats who have been assigned there from their capitals to show up, it takes a long time to understand it. Its agenda is rather backwards facing. It's an anachronistic organization because of decisions that were made decades ago, and because it changes so slowly, whether it's in structure, and the issue of Security Council reform has been mentioned. My first job at UN headquarters, I was working for Secretary General Boutros Ghali. That's how long ago it was, in 1996. And I was assigned as a junior staff member to support the high-level panel on Security Council reform. That was in 1996. I can tell you, there's been absolutely no change to today from the status back then. So whether it's structural changes or the cultural changes that are necessary, it goes very, very slow. It is almost exclusively influenced by member states. And as important as civil society is, as cities are as multinational corporations can be, depending, the influence it responds to is member states, and especially the most important member states. And given that dynamic, sometimes the issues that the United Nations is working on do not reflect the most pressing needs of the day as perceived by civil society, by populations. So some of the things that are very much on the agenda of today, catastrophic risks of different kinds, certainly climate change, although Janos Pastor is in the audience, he was one of the most foremost voices on climate change issues. So that's when he was an Assistant Secretary General in the UN. That, of course, has received a lot of attention by the UN, but issues of artificial intelligence, climate engineering, bioengineering, designer babies, cyberspace, the UN is very slow to move into these areas. More pragmatically, on the ground, when the UN is working humanitarian assistance, development assistance, peace and security, it tends to work from an input-driven approach. We're going to send a peacekeeping mission. We're going to have a development program on education or whatever, as opposed to an outcomes-oriented approach. People look at things more from an outcome perspective. What difference have you made? The issue of elections was mentioned. People actually aren't interested in elections. They're interested in democracy and accountability, as Mina said in the previous session. And until the UN is more focused on the outcomes that need to be achieved and delivering those outcomes, as the Sustainable Development Goals are sort of oriented to, but so much of the actual work of the UN on the ground is very much from their own perspective rather than the perceived needs of civil society. And until that changes, I think civil society people are going to continue to feel very disconnected from the work of the organization.
Hajer, and you're doing an amazing job because you're trying to build those bridges between that global UN narrative and the local problems and the grassroots movements with these two movements you're part of, extremely together, and together we build it. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience, the results you've seen, and also how can we scale this up?
Yeah. Long story short, so my journey to work within civil society, or being an activist actually, it started in 2011, and that was when the revolution, sometimes now we started to call it war, happened in Libya. Before that, I had no idea about what is human rights, peace and security, humanitarian, what is a civil society organization, just for one reason, because I was living under a regime that didn't allow that. So the only form of activism people had or knew, it was a charity organization. When I was in my school, I joined a charity organization, which was a really big deal at that time, because basically you cannot address anything political. And from what we've seen today, all the challenges that we are talking about, it is purely political, more or less. So then when the revolution happened, I remember I volunteered to work at the hospital. And I was just thinking that for the whole time, for the whole 6 months when the war was actually taking place, all what we were thinking of is that the minute the revolution or the war stops, then it's just going to be a heaven. And actually, we made it more explicit. We were saying we're going to end up like Dubai. Yes, we're on our way, hopefully. But then I remember during the time when I was working at the hospital, I was just reflecting that actually there is so much to be done, not only on a political level. So we didn't only need a political change, but we also need the social change. And then I just thought of the structure of a charity organization, and I was thinking, well, maybe I can start that, but instead of working on charity, I'll just work on the society in itself. And I must admit, I thought it was a social invention. If this prize and competition was taking place at that time, most probably I would have submitted that idea, because I've never heard of civil society organizations, neither the UN, neither any sort of global organization that was basically working on the issues that related to us. However, the first time I personally interacted with it, Security Council UN, it was during the Libyan revolution and during the war, because of course the international community had a strong influence on the process in itself. So then we started with the Together We Build It organization. It was me and another colleagues who co-founded that. And we started from zero. We didn't have any experience at all. We didn't know how to run an organization, or what does it mean actually to work on an organization. So we had that capacity building process, but then there was also content-wise. Then we realized that, oh, there's a lot of content when it comes to human rights. There is conventions. There are things that are already there outside that can promote our rights and protect it. And then, so that was, it took a year for us to really put ourselves together. And then in 2012, while we were advocating for women's rights in the Constitution Assembly, we had a security incident where we realized that, well, when it comes to peace and security, it's not always, you know, the rigid idea of peace and security where it needs to be addressed by experts in security. When we talk about peace and security, we're talking about personal security, we're talking about human security. And I remember, as a follow-up to the incident we had, we met with the former Minister of Justice at that time in Libya. And he said, well, you know, if you are a woman and you want to work on the peace and security agenda, then you need to get yourself familiar with something called the Security Council Resolution 1325. And imagine at that time I was 19 years old, and I was like, what does that supposed to mean? So then I Googled it, and I got to the document in itself, and I really struggled to really understand that document. However, now I do realize that maybe I don't really need to understand the technical document in itself. And earlier we were talking about the language. The language part, of course, it contributes to the gap. But then I think what we misunderstand is that when we talk about the language part, there is, of course, the technical language part that is needed. So I don't need to understand every single word in a Security Council resolution document, but it needs to be relevant to me on the ground to some extent. It needs to be simple to people to really understand that this is something that relates to them. And this is what we do. For example, with the Together We Build It organization, we always emphasize that, well, what we're doing, we're bringing the two societies together, because these global resolutions, for example, the Security Council, and the reason I'm talking a lot about the Security Council, because for Libyans, if you would ask any Libyan, most probably now they know the Security Council because it had played an important role within the revolution. So bringing these two perspectives together, it's very important. And then also from working on ground, we realized that, well, it is our issues, it's issues that affects us directly as citizens, but then in the same time, we cannot be the only ones who are trying to find a solution. And then we realized that actually there is people out there, outside of the country, trying to find solutions for us. But are we actually trying to do that together? If you look at it in terms of, are we meeting? Yes, we are meeting. Are we discussing? Yes, we are discussing the same agenda, more or less. But are we actually really talking to each other in a very simple way, as in terms of, okay, we have a problem here, for instance, in Libya. It's a peace and security problem. How can we sit and solve this? I can tell you, I've been working on this for 7 years now almost, and in every single meeting we have from our side or the international community side, it has been always it's really like a rigid formal meeting where you actually need to prep for that. And every time we work with, so my organization lead a project called 1325 Network Project, and basically we work with different organizations on ground. And every time we say, okay, we have a national process that is going on, a peace building process. We want to influence that. And the first question that many people say, and especially women, because these are the groups that we work with, they would say, but how can we actually go to a meeting with the UN? What sort of preparations do we need? And we always find that question a bit ironic, because as a matter of fact, you don't need any sort of preparation because you are the experts on ground. If you are affected by the issue, then you don't need to prepare yourself to how to explain the issue. There is a colleague from Yemen that I work with a lot, and one time he really explained this problem very well when we were discussing, okay, how can we actually promote the work of the UN and build these bridges? And then he said, well, as a matter of fact, what we've been focusing on so much is we're trying to explain the UN to the world instead of explaining the world to the UN. And I think that's the thing that only needs to be changed, basically. And that's what we are trying to do as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I sincerely feel super inspired with such a young leader, and I think that there are clear messages for everyone who is watching around the world. So you are working on the challenge of linking a global and a local narrative, but Cristina, you recently wrote that there is a big challenge of creating global narratives and that we're lacking global narratives. And you gave two amazing examples, that the Panama Papers and the Save the Bees, but what are these other catastrophic risks missing so they can create a global narrative that we can act on? And maybe you have other examples that can give us hope to everyone here.
Again, the challenge of building global narratives is because we are not talking about a homogeneous fact. Global doesn't mean that it affects everyone the same way, and that as you said, it's perceived by everyone in the same way. That is a challenge in itself. As I said, the lack of global outlets is another challenge. But there is a growing, we can see an incipient global conscience that affects all these issues. And in the previous panel, the Me Too movement was mentioned. I love that example. And because I really think, or at least in many places, that the conversation about gender is changing. And that we are having that conversation not only among women, which used to be the normal thing, but also men are more and more participating, and that we are changing the parameters. We are starting to see clear, or at least I think we are starting to transmit clearly, that the gender conversation is not about how women can move to the male's world, but how we change society. Again, talking about the previous panel, changing and transformation. In that case, it was very interesting because I think it was triggered by the triumph of Donald Trump. I mean, that moved the women's in the United States to move out. Without the Me Too movement, we couldn't have seen the Western thing, without the Women's March, that were the early reaction to the triumph of Donald Trump, we wouldn't have seen the Me Too movement and all the other things. And you asked me about new examples. I think this is very, very specific, but I think this global conscience against plastics is growing. And it is really interesting because it affects many layers of global action, from the industry to the citizens. But I think it's also very important because we can share with all of us, we can share with citizens that each of us can act and has something to do about it. It's not just about global decisions, which are far away, difficult to understand, difficult to reach and difficult to implement, but each of us can do something. And I'm seeing that in the plastics world. So we maybe for instance, again, the European Union just introduced a new normative that in several months we will have to end the use of one-use plastic bottles, things, and also bags. And you know that has been triggered by citizens' action, by the peoples. Yeah.
So the importance of momentum also for changing some trends and building global narrative. And regarding momentum, I want to talk about the Ebola crisis. We've been mentioning the Ebola crisis throughout the day, and we have we're very lucky because Tony here kind of led part of the Ebola crisis and can tell us from the first hand what changed in order to connect more with the people and all the communication challenges you had.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. I want to add one thing, though, to what Cristina just said about the role of individuals, and in this case, really the role of leaders and how big a difference they can make. In the United Nations now, the Secretary General has created basically gender parity at the top levels of the organization. The senior leaders of the organization are now half women, or I think maybe even a little bit more than half. And this is really, it doesn't sound like much in some respects maybe, but for the United Nations being a rather anachronistic organization, this is a big development, and he deserves a lot of credit for it, and it's because he is now creating this enabling environment in that organization. You start to see changes that in the past may not have been possible. So the power of individual action, whether you're a leader like the Secretary General or from civil society, Hajer, it can really make a difference. On Ebola, yes, I was asked by the previous Secretary General out of nowhere to lead the UN's response to the Ebola crisis, really. And we created this first ever UN emergency health mission and got on the ground. And there are many things you can say about Ebola, but if you ask me in the end what was critical to ending the crisis, most people wouldn't guess the answer, although Moussaka Kalla from Ministry of Health of Liberia, if he's in here, I bet he would. It was the communities, it was the population, it was their changed behavior. And early on in the response, some big mistakes were made in terms of the relationship between the entities doing the response, UN, NGOs, government, and the population. And the communication messages, there's no treatment for Ebola, or the actions like, oh, corpses need to be burned, and so traditional burial practices cannot be respected. This drove the communities away from what was necessary for the response. Once governments, United Nations realized the importance of engaging with the communities and started directly working with them, changing the messages, changing the messengers, and using local trusted voices in local languages, whether they were religious leaders, community leaders, village leaders. Once that engagement started taking place, then communities started changing their behaviors in the ways that were essential to ending the crisis, basically having safe burials and making sure people with the disease were isolated. And once that engagement really took place in a quality way, the whole trajectory of the epidemic changed. So it was, yes, the doctors, the nurses, the logisticians, the senior people all had an important role to play, but in the end it was communities that made the difference. One last observation about the importance of society's engagement with the UN. There needs to be a receptive approach, and I think this Secretary General is very committed to it. The organization is slow to change, but there is an openness on the part of the Secretariat. But on the other side, how do you penetrate? How do you get in? And Hajer was talking about that. One quick story. I was speaking with an ambassador from a member of a permanent member of the Security Council from the West, and I was asking him, well, why are you doing this in the Security Council? Why are you pushing that particular agenda? And he says, you know, we're very influenced in capitals by our civil societies. We have our NGOs, we have our civil society. And it dawned on me how some of these actions, which I hadn't quite understood why, because it didn't seem to align completely with the normal foreign policy of that government, how influenced they were by civil society. So civil society, in order to influence the UN, doesn't only need to do it talking to a UN representative in a meeting on First Avenue. It can also be done through their government representatives in capitals.
Great. So Ebola crisis is a perfect example of the need of explaining the world to the UN, apparently. So Hajer, regarding the UN calls to action, we have now the 2030 agenda, and the UN is making several calls to action. For this World Environmental Day, we're going to have a big call to action on plastics and marine plastic pollution. So how can we make this call to action last? Through civil society.
Yeah. So I worked with the Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and that was before 2015. And then in 2015, the Security Council adopted another Security Council resolution called 2250 on youth, peace and security. And the story of this particular resolution, I find it very interesting, and for me as a young person, because I took part in the process before that. So I remember in 2014, different civil society organizations, young groups from different places around the world were talking about an idea, just an idea, to convince the Security Council to adopt a formal recognition where the Council would admit that young people have a role to play in peace building. And it was a very interesting journey, because during that time we worked a lot on advocacy, so advocating towards national governments, advocating towards the UN directly. And in several meetings where this advocacy took place, it was very interesting to see the response of the people we met with, basically seniors, government representatives, but also UN representatives. And I remember in this one meeting, I was from Libya, and it was a mission, and there was another girl from Spain, and then there was another girl from Colombia as well. And in the meeting, basically you have young people coming to this senior guy, and we were saying, well, we want the Security Council to adopt this resolution. And he literally said this: I don't think that even your grandchildren are going to see such a resolution. And it was very striking for us. That was actually in 2014, end of 2014. It was very striking for us. Not the fact that it was difficult. We knew it was very difficult to convince the Security Council to adopt such a resolution, for instance. But the fact that the way he said it. And we were actually thinking, what was the importance to say such a thing for us? However, it didn't make it less for us than to continue working. We did. And it was, you can just imagine that for me at that time, but also for many young people around the world, who's really even at the age of 13 and 15, for example, sitting, watching the Security Council adopt a resolution that they actually called for. And that would have never happened unless we actually partnered with the UN. So during that process, we were working with different UN agencies where people from outside the UN with people from inside the UN working together to convince the UN to adopt such a resolution, for instance, basically a recognition. So what you were talking about earlier, it's very important, of course, for us to not only focus on what the UN can do, but also what can we actually do, because we have this big institution, and throughout what we've been talking about today, honestly, after these discussions, I cannot imagine of any other organization can, at this point where we are in now, any other organization who can actually find solutions or do anything like that. So it's not only about what the UN is doing wrong, or what are the things that the UN is missing, but it's also about what can we actually do to support the UN to do their work. And I think the opening statement today, it was very impressive for me, because there were things I knew, hearing how difficult it is to reform the Security Council, for instance. These are things that we knew, but the difference for me, at least, is it was to actually hear someone from inside of the UN saying that out loud. And I think this is what we need, because we do recognize that there is a problem. But in the same time, we want the UN to admit that there is a problem, so then we can actually go to our national governments and tell them that, well, it's not only a problem that we recognize from outside the UN, but you're also actually not allowing the UN to do their work, basically. Yeah.
No, and having that discussion here is one of the first steps towards that reform we all want to see. So I'm going to give the floor also to the audience. Marcus, do you have questions from Twitter?
Yeah, sure. Let's start with two. So one of them I think may be suitable for Hajer is, how do citizens and organized civil society hold not only governments but powerful global companies to account, particularly when most aren't beholding to democratic accountability? That's from Alvin Carpio from Twitter. And then a second one is the definition of a global catastrophic risk. The one that Global Challenges Foundation usually talks about is that it's something that might kill up to 1 billion people. And so I was wondering, how are these risks being dealt with by the UN currently?
Perfect. So maybe, Hajer, you can answer the first question, and then Tony and Cristina can comment on the second one.
I mean, a simple answer for that would be through government regulations. Actually, I can't think of any other way but to be through government regulations. And I think what happened recently with Facebook, for instance, but also other companies, we can clearly see that, for example, when it comes to the matter of privacy, the only way to actually make sure that these companies will take these issues seriously and doesn't only start looking at profits, but also what these obstacles affect on people themselves, it would be through government regulations. But then the $1 million question is, how can we actually get these government regulations and make sure that these regulations are in favor of the people themselves, rather than perhaps a compensation between these governments and these companies, for instance? Yeah.
So communication, how do we define global catastrophic risks, and how can we address them?
Well, how can we define them? Again, it goes to different organizations and individuals. That definition that the foundation gives, it's too broad, in my opinion, for the general public to understand. It is too large, it is too scary, and when we tackle as human beings such scary scenarios, we just try to block them, to hide them. And one of the characters, or one of the features of our time is, at least in the Western world, is that we live under fear. And we need to take the fear out of the equation, because that leads to paralysis. So I could forget about the 1 billion thing, it's too large, and I could appeal to organizations, institutions, civil society, politicians, and citizens to become more responsible, to become more conscious of that global risk. And I think it's a common task. I don't think there is a single solution. It's up to each of us to see how we can contribute to make the world a better place. This is a very easy thing to say and very difficult to tackle, but I really believe in personal responsibility and to push that forward to organizations, institutions, and governments.
Tony, you're a teacher. How would you teach about global risks?
There are urgent global risks, current crises like the wars in Libya, Yemen, Syria, the injustices happening in places like DRC, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Mali. Then there are all the development challenges that have been talked about today, but those all affect individual populations as opposed to global risk. Climate change is obviously in my view, the biggest existential risk the planet faces. That's very long term. The risks that might kill 1 billion people in a relatively short time, they're basically two. It's nuclear war and it's pandemics. Nuclear war, that hopefully is an extremely remote possibility and not going to materialize. Pandemics, what's happening in Ebola today, as we sit here in Mbandaka, a city with a population of 1.2 million people, we don't know what's going to be the situation in 1 week's time. When we were doing the Ebola crisis response in 2014, we did not know how it was going to end. At a certain point, at least, the world started throwing all the resources it had at it. We had no idea how it was going to end. It could have been much, much, much worse. Things, the way the world responded started to change and the world got its act together, and fortunately communities did what they did, and national governments, the local governments, did some really great work at this sort of second stage of the response. But it could have been much, much, much worse. The current disease, the current crisis can get much, much, much worse. And if it's not Ebola this year, it could be a different disease next year. So and the world is not prepared for it. The systems are not in place, the structures, the planning, the game plan to figure out how to end it is not there. So to me, that's the biggest risk and something that needs a lot more attention.
Okay, so Ebola, nuclear, and climate change. And I must say that having worked for so many years in climate change, I think that a signal that the global narrative is changing is that most of the people here today are saying that climate change is one, if not the most pressing issue we have today, and that really comforts me in a sense that I see this narrative changing quite fast. Well, we still have 3 minutes, and I think we need to take advantage of this amazing group. So Marcus, give us the last question, the best one.
Oh my, oh my. Let me check Twitter again. Okay, so let's go with this one. So Florian Hanganu from Facebook is wondering, what is the effect of an increasingly politically affiliated media on our politics?
Okay.
Sorry, the impact, I didn't hear well.
An increasingly politically affiliated media.
Oof.
Christina, let's start with you and each give us more comment on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure we are seeing more affiliated media. I think it's more blunt, the way they operate. I mean the problem is that supposedly independent media are not acting independently. Many decades, centuries ago, many newspapers were linked to ideology and so on, and it was normal. We haven't spoken in these global narrative things about the impact of fake news and how disinformation is transforming those global narratives. And that's also very important to me, again, to work from grassroots movements upwards, because one of the effects of these things, and Facebook knows it very, very well, is how they are impacting in populism. And how that fear that I was mentioning before is being used by populist movements and by several people. They are playing with fear to construct other completely different narratives that we don't want to hear about, but they are there. And so they are politically biased, yes, but again, everyone has that responsibility, and education is key for people to start identifying what can be fake, what cannot be fake, how you are being manipulated, because that is, if not, we don't have a remedy for this.
Tony, any brief comment on that?
Yeah, to deal with global catastrophic risks, the starting point needs to be a recognition of the seriousness of the risk, and a belief that something can be done about it. And whether it's a politically influenced media or fake news or the increasing polarization of society or atomization of it because of social media, it becomes harder and harder for the center to come together in recognition of just the basic facts and realities, and then the need to do something about it, and how to, by supporting an accountable government. That is becoming more and more difficult, and I think that's a huge, huge problem. The United Nations can play a very important role there, both through its convening authority, but also because it's a trusted voice. For whatever its faults may be, people around the world believe the UN and look to it as a trusted voice. And that's something that I know its communications people are looking at how better to amplify, and I think it can be part of the solution.
Hajer, just close this panel.
Well, the thought I had to close this panel with, I just realized it's going to be so pessimistic, so I'm going to drop that. I don't think we need more of that today. But I think as in terms of an impact, it really highlighted the extreme gray area between freedom of speech and hate speech. And that's, I think this is one of the biggest dilemmas that the UN, but also governments needs to deal with. I mean, freedom of speech as a human right, of course, it's very fundamental. But then how can we deal with it when you are confused if it's actually freedom of speech or hate speech, for instance, which of course can lead to so many other impacts, for example, violence. Yeah.
I agree. Well, I want to thank the panelists for such an amazing discussion, and also the Global Challenges Foundation for inviting us here to have this discussion and for making these 3 days possible. And for the audience, you have been great, and thanks for staying with us. And have a good night.